Good afternoon, and welcome to our virtual event, Effective Policing and the Rule of Law. I'm Raihan Salam, president of the Manhattan Institute, and I'm honored to be hosting a discussion today with Senator Tom Cotton, one of Congress's leading voices on policing and criminal justice. Today's event will proceed as follows. After my brief introduction, Senator Cotton and I will discuss the policy debates that have arisen in the wake of the George Floyd protests in cities across the country. Throughout our conversation, please feel free to submit questions on whatever platform you're using to watch us, and we will do our best to address them during the Q&A portion. I'm honored to be joined by Senator Cotton, and Senator, thank you for being here. Senator Cotton has represented the people of Arkansas in the US Senate since 2015. Prior to that, he served a term in the US House of Representatives, and before entering political life, he served in the United States Army as an infantry officer, completing 2 combat tours. For the purposes of our conversation today, it is also worth mentioning that Senator Cotton has been an important and sometimes dissenting voice within his party on criminal justice issues. He has emphasized the need to preserve crime reduction as the main priority of criminal justice policy. Senator Cotton has forcefully made the case against defunding the police and has argued for officials at all levels to do their part in curtailing the rioting we've seen alongside protests in a number of cities. His op-ed in the New York Times calling on the Trump administration to invoke the Insurrection Act in the event that local officials did not curtail rioting sparked an ongoing conversation about our media's ability to cover contentious political debates. We have a lot of ground to cover, so without further ado, I'm excited to welcome Senator Cotton. Senator, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Raihan, for having me. It's good to be on with you, and thanks to the Manhattan Institute for hosting this forum, as well as all of the very important work the Institute has done over the last 30 or 40 years to try to address the problem of crime in America.
Senator, we find ourselves in a very polarized moment, a moment when the left has become increasingly dominant in urban America and the right increasingly dominant in rural corners of the country. Yet you've chosen to engage on a quintessentially urban issue. The prevalence of violent crime, what appears to be a return of violent crime in our major cities. I wonder if you could share a bit about your motivation, in entering what has become an incredibly contentious conversation.
Raihan, America needs our cities to be safe and to be strong and to be prosperous, for America to be safe and strong and prosperous. We are a nation that's knit together of many different kinds of lands and people spread across a great continent. And while places like New York or San Francisco or LA can't grow our food or produce our fiber and timber, we also need our cities out in the heartland to help market those goods, to help finance them, to help provide a lot of the services that we don't have across the country. That's why it's so important that our cities are vibrant and strong and prosperous. And I can tell you, I know so many Arkansans who they may not want to live in New York or may not travel there often. It is a place that they love as well. There's a reason why the slogan says, "I love New York." But right now, too many of our cities are suffering very badly. If you just look at what's happened over the last couple months, really over the last 6 months, at crime rates, especially murder and shooting rates in places like New York or Chicago or Washington, it's heartbreaking to see so many lives of our fellow Americans shattered. I believe that we can do a lot better. I believe that we've demonstrated over the last 30 years that we can do a lot better. Some of these cities face the same challenges in extremely high crime rates, extremely high shooting and murder rates in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And it was due in no small part to conservatives and Republicans in office to help turn around that very high level of crime. And obviously Rudy Giuliani helped contribute to that in New York City. But some of the ideas that came from conservative intellectuals or Republican office holders who were leading minds on criminal justice policy and policing tactics really did help make our cities safe and livable again, whether it was community policing or the broken windows approach to policing or technological breakthroughs like CompStat or what have you. It was Republicans who helped make our cities safe in the 1990s and 2000s and contributed to the incredible decline in serious and violent crime that we saw starting in the mid-1990s and coming up until just recently. I think that we can contribute the same thing again, partly by getting back to those fundamentals, by reminding people that those low level of crimes are not just naturally occurring, They don't just happen. They have to be actively advocated through policies that are designed to keep our city safe. And I want to commend the Manhattan Institute here again for being on the forefront of that thought, going back to the 80s and the 90s, developing many of the ideas through your scholars and their writing about how to keep our city safe. I have no doubt the Manhattan Institute is going to be on the forefront of that again.
Senator, you're part of a generation that has lived through an incredible urban renaissance. Starting in the 1990s, as you've observed, you saw steep crime declines. And yet, as part of that generation, you see many people who have taken that kind of public safety for granted. And that's not exclusively people on the left. Many of your colleagues in Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, have embraced the cause of what is known as criminal justice reform, the idea that we need to create a more permissive system, that we need to reduce sentences, that we can move in a more permissive direction and yet preserve these gains in public safety. And you've been a pretty forceful voice in opposition to that, particularly prominently in the debate over the First Step Act, which passed with the support of the White House and the support of a large number of Republicans. Can you tell us a bit about that debate and why you were so firm in your conviction to oppose that legislation?
Sure, Raihan. Well, the first thing we should do is be honest about the terms here. What many people call sentencing reform or criminal justice reform is really criminal leniency. It's cutting sentences for serious and repeat offenders. Now, again, to be honest, you hear a term called nonviolent low-level offenders or something like that. What they really mean are drug traffickers. Now, maybe those drug traffickers didn't actually fire the gun that's used in drug crimes, but anywhere you see drug trafficking, you see high levels of violent crime. It is endemic to the drug trade. Furthermore, in federal prison, which the First Step Act touched, there is really no such thing as a low-level nonviolent offender. Now, it's possible among the 200,000 or so prisoners that we had in the federal prison system before that law passed that there may be some isolated cases. If that's so, then that can be addressed through commutations or through presidential pardons if the law and the facts in extreme circumstances produce what many people would consider a manifestly unjust result. But what the First Step Act did was cut sentences for serious drug traffickers, repeat felons, that put them back on the streets. And unfortunately, given the reality of recidivism rates in this country, has simply led to crimes committed by people who would still be in prison today. More broadly, though, many states have taken actions like the First Step Act by reducing sentences for drug traffickers or for first-time offenders, even if the offense is violent, or cutting things like three strikes laws. One of the most indisputable facts that's been established about criminal justice policy over the last 50 years is when you have more police and more prison time for criminals, you have less crime. No matter what the New York Times said, there's always that old joke about the New York Times headlines like, despite increasing incarceration rate, crime continues to fall. Reversing the relationship, of course, it is an indisputable fact that if criminals, most of whom are repeat criminals, are in prison, they are incapable of committing crimes that endanger public safety. Now, some states may have criminal sentencing laws that are overly harsh in some cases. I'm willing to entertain that. I'm not going to do a 50-state review of all criminal laws. But when we're talking about drug traffickers, about repeat felons, or about violent felons, they need to be in prison. That's what's going to keep our community safe.
Why is it that so many people on the right, so many people you would think would be sympathetic to this perspective, have moved in the direction of embracing a less, some would say a less punitive approach, others would say a more permissive, more lenient approach? What is this? Not, I don't want you to betray any confidences, but I'm curious as to what you think is going on there.
Well, first, I think there's a case of historic amnesia. So many office holders today, so many young policy staffers or aides or think tank scholars didn't live through what we lived through in the late 1980s and the early and mid 1990s. They don't remember a time when New York City had over 2,000 murders a year. They don't remember a time when it was unsafe to go in many public spaces in our cities. Again, in some ways, the criminal justice reformers of the 1990s have been victims of their own success. Crime had fallen so far in so many cities that, again, to cite that old New York Times headline, it seemed the paradox that you had crime so low was betrayed by having so many people in prison. And if we just put these people out of prison, then surely crime would stay the same. That's just not the case. It's like defunding our police. The police are not provocation that lead to crime. The police are what keep crime rates under control. We've seen over the last couple months what happens when the police are castigated or when they pull back because they're either in situations where crowds have overmatched them or their politicians that lead them refuse to let them enforce the law. What happens to crime rates? So one, I think it's a matter of historic amnesia. At the state level, there is budgetary pressure. Most governors, even in Republican states, most legislatures would rather spend money on education or healthcare or tax cuts rather than spending it on prisons. Not many people benefit immediately from a prison, but we all benefit collectively by having hardened criminals locked up behind bars. Now, that's not an issue in the federal system because the Bureau of Prisons is such a small part of the federal budget, and obviously federal prison accounts for a very small percentage of prisoners nationwide in our country. But at the state level, I think there are budgetary concerns as well. But I would liken the budget that states spend on things like our police officers, like our prisons, like our court system, to what we spend in the federal government on our military. It is the most fundamental responsibility of our government, local, state, and federal, to keep us safe. And that's safe from crime or that's safe from foreign threats.
More recently, you've seen more calls, particularly from Democrats, though not exclusively from Democrats, for a greater amount of federal involvement in local policing, including in some cases quite prescriptive regulations. You've seen a number of lawmakers propose, for example, bans on chokeholds and other things that would very stringently regulate the actual operations of local police forces. I'm curious about your thoughts on the appropriate federal role in policing, which is, of course, typically a state and local function. Are there things that the federal government ought to be doing more of? Are there ways in which you might be seeing an overreach of federal authority?
Well, the federal government plays some role in local policing techniques because the Department of Justice gives grants out to law enforcement agencies. But you're right, Raihan, that policing by and large happens at the local level and secondarily at the state level in our country. And what's right for policing in New York City may not be right for San Francisco, or certainly neither one of them may be right for rural towns in places like Arkansas. One reason I sponsored Tim Scott's legislation on policing reform last month is it did not take that overly prescriptive approach. In fact, in some cases, it wanted to get more data, more evidence on policing techniques and the way police are disciplined if they've engaged in misconduct before adopting those prescriptive approaches to things like chokeholds. I think we should be open-minded to what that data says, but I also don't think that we should rush to put the heavy hand of federal regulation on local police departments without a solid evidentiary basis. Look, we ask our police officers to take a very, very tough challenge every single day. They put on the uniform, they put on the badge, and they go on patrol not knowing if they're going to come home that night. And they are confronted often with violent criminals or with very tense, difficult circumstances of people who may be high on drugs or maybe drunk or maybe get involved in a domestic dispute where it's not clear all of the facts. Those are very difficult circumstances to put police officers in every single day. And they do it. And by and large, they do it with a great degree of professionalism and respect for the rights of our citizens and concern for our public safety. And we ought to be sympathetic to putting them in those situations rather than rushing to adopt that kind of prescriptive approach. Now, again, we should be open-minded once we understand all of that information, all the evidence that we can collect, but we shouldn't rush to judgments and think that everyone in Washington knows better than local police departments and their chiefs and their sergeants and the patrol cops on the beat.
The Justice Act wound up getting a great deal of pushback from Democrats in the Senate. I wonder why, I'm curious to your thoughts as to why that stalled, why that didn't wind up becoming more of a consensus proposal.
The Democrats wanted it as a political issue in the campaign. They didn't want it as a piece of legislation that could be signed into law and make a difference in our communities. I mean, Chuck Schumer has essentially admitted as much in recent days. I think they made a mistake on that. Tim Scott himself said that he would offer the very amendments that Democrats were demanding we have a vote on. Because remember, the Democrats didn't vote against that bill. They simply voted to stop debate from even beginning. We could have had a debate on the bill. Tim Scott pledged that he personally would offer the amendments the Democrats wanted to vote on We could have voted them up or down, and we could have moved on to the final vote on the bill. And that too the Democrats would have had a chance to filibuster at 60 votes. But I think they made the decision that they would rather campaign on this issue in November than try to address the problem now. Again, I think that's a miscalculation. If Democrats want to go to the election in November as the party that refuses to condemn these insurrectionists, anarchists, rioters, and looters in our street, as you saw in Seattle over the weekend, with rioters breaking into stores and simply stealing their wares without a police presence anywhere in sight, that's an issue that Republicans should be happy to campaign on. What we would rather do, though, is try to get a result that improves the problem. But if the Democrats insist upon taking it to the voters, then the voters will make a decision, and I don't think they're going to give the decision the Democrats want.
You've offered your own proposal, the Better Policing Community Recognition Act. I wonder if you could share a bit of information about it with us.
Yeah, it would offer cash rewards for police officers who have been recognized for engaging in best practices, for excelling in their work, for exhibiting the highest degrees of professionalism. It'd be a program administered by the Department of Justice, as other programs are similarly administered. I think it's important that even as we recognize that police departments have some officers who engage in misconduct, and sometimes even criminal misconduct, the vast majority of officers at all levels of law enforcement do what they do because they believe in our country, they believe in their communities, they want to protect others from harm, and they're willing to put their life on the line to do it. I can tell you that a couple of weeks ago, we had the Attorney General in Arkansas, we had a law enforcement roundtable, and one of the biggest concerns that we heard from police chiefs and sheriffs was their growing challenges in recruiting and retaining the top talent in their communities. Pay is already stretched thin. Hours are very long. The work is very dangerous. They've got a lot of sheriff's deputies. They've got a lot of officers who think, this is not for me. It matches the stories we've seen from places like Washington, D.C. or New York City with early retirements, or polls saying that more than half of all officers are thinking about leaving the force. Morale, recruiting, and retention is a real challenge with law enforcement agencies today. And this legislation is just one small way to say in a concrete fashion, we respect you, we thank you, we want to honor and reward what you do.
One backdrop for this debate, and one reason it's become so toxic, is this notion that our criminal justice system, our law enforcement agencies, are plagued by racism that is incredibly pervasive, and that this is a reason to move in this more permissive direction. It's this idea that this stringent focus on reducing violent crime and proactive policing is in effect racist. I wonder about your thoughts on this. Obviously this has been a huge part of the larger public conversation. It has poisoned many people's views of law enforcement agencies, and I wonder about your perspective.
I don't think our law enforcement agencies are systemically racist. I don't think our institutions are either. Do those institutions have some people who have racially prejudiced views? No doubt. When you talk about law enforcement across the country, you're talking about millions of people. Of course, there are some people who have those noxious views, but the vast, vast majority of all peace officers in this country do not see the color of one's skin when they go out on patrol. They see fellow citizens who are there trying to protect from violent criminals. You can see that in public opinion polling as well. Whether you're polling whites, blacks, or other racial minorities, the respect for the police is extremely high, and they recognize the vital work that police do in their neighborhoods to keep them safe. And that when the police pull back, or when the police are condemned, you have the kind of violence we've seen, unfortunately, over the last 2 months across the country. And many of those claims really echo what we heard in the 60s and the 70s from liberals who first denied that we had a rising crime wave in our country. And then they attributed it to so-called root causes, poverty or lack of education or so forth. And then when all that failed, they just condemned it as racist to point out that we had this crime wave. That didn't stop the crime wave. That didn't save all of the Black lives that were being lost in our cities. That didn't save any lives that were being lost to violent crime across our country. What saved those lives starting in the 1990s are the kind of policing reforms that the Manhattan Institute and other conservative institutions and Republican office holders implemented all across the country. That's what we're going to need again to protect our fellow citizens of all races.
You've mentioned on more than one occasion the sharp spike we've seen in homicides in a number of major cities around the country, the increase in gun violence we've seen. over the past few months. Do you see this as a potentially durable phenomenon or just a blip connected perhaps to the COVID crisis?
Well, I worry a lot that not just over the last 2 months, but some of the increasing crime we've seen over the last 6 months, over the last 2 or 3 years, perhaps, is the beginning of a new crime wave. I hope that's not the case. I hope that the president and governors and mayors will be able to get this crime under control, that we won't lose more innocent lives in the weeks and the months ahead. But I do worry that with the potential election of Joe Biden and a Democratic majority in the Congress, with mayors and governors who are unwilling to defend their police and allow their police to protect innocent lives and properties, as you've seen in places like Portland and Seattle, that criminals in those cities and across the country will begin to get the picture that no one is going to stop them when they loot an Apple store. No one will stop them when they burn down a police precinct or a police officers union building. And that crime will only continue to grow, and that it will spiral far beyond public institutions or police buildings and go into retributions or turf wars between drug gangs or what have you, because these criminals believe that they are not going to be policed and captured and imprisoned for their misdeeds. We should send the exact opposite message. We should send the message that the police will defend innocent life, the police will defend property, and that our prosecutors will pursue you and we will put you in jail to protect public safety.
During the recent protests in cities around the country in the wake of the death of George Floyd, you had some number of peaceful protesters, but you also had quite a few violent activists, disruptors, criminals who were trying to exploit this moment for their own gain. And in the midst of that crisis, you published an op-ed in the New York Times arguing that the federal government, that the president ought to invoke the Insurrection Act to take firm action to prevent and to tamp down looting and other kinds of violence. Can you tell us a bit about that experience? Obviously that's something that has sparked a lot of conversation since then, but just a bit about the context behind why you made that case initially and about what came afterwards.
Well, first, let me apologize to all of our viewers, since it's made the New York Times even more unreadable than it previously was. Although they also said they were going to cut the number of op-eds that they were publishing from that point forward. So maybe I can take advance credit for reducing the number of terrible left-wing woke op-eds you have to read in the New York Times. But the case I made in that New York Times op-ed was very simple. The military stands ready as a force of last resort to protect our citizens' lives and their property. And there's a long history of using the Insurrection Act that is more than 200 years old to help restore and maintain order. 101st Airborne was sent to Little Rock in 1957 to override a racist Democratic governor who used our National Guard until Eisenhower also federalized it to integrate Little Rock Central. John F. Kennedy did the same thing in 1962 and 1963 in Alabama and Mississippi. LBJ had to do so in 1968, just blocks from the White House. In fact, on the same exact streets where some of those riots were happening in early June. And George Bush 41 did so in Los Angeles to stop the riots there in 1991. Again, the federal troops, the active military, is a force of last resort. Police officers, sheriff's deputies are always the first resort in our streets and our communities. But if they're overwhelmed, or if left-wing mayors won't allow them to do their job, the next step is the National Guard. And that happened in Washington, D.C. It happened in part because the National Guard is answerable not to the left-wing mayor of Washington, but to the Department of Defense. My op-ed was published on a Monday. I said that if the situation doesn't get under control, the Insurrection Act should be used as a tool of last resort. Well, the National Guard was out in force along with specialized law enforcement agencies that Monday night, that Tuesday night, that Wednesday night, and the situation was brought under control. But with the situation spiraling out of control in cities across the country, of course the president had to entertain at least the contingency of using active duty troops. And that's why we had troops from the 82nd Airborne and the 10th Mountain Division staged outside of Washington, prepared to defend innocent life and property around the city. Now, I'm glad it didn't come to that, but the president always has to be prepared to act under the law that Congress has given him for over 200 years to protect our citizens. It wouldn't come to that, though, if more governors and mayors would take this rioting seriously.
Why do you think New York Times staffers were in open revolt after the publication of this op-ed? Do you kind of have any intuition as to what was going on there?
Uh, well, I think the woke children in the New York Times have taken over management of it, along with Twitter in general. The publisher and the op-ed editor both defended the op-ed's publication initially, even if they disagreed with the argument. But within a couple of days, they walked that back under massive internal pressure. And then the publisher is not much more than a woke child himself, threw the op-ed editor overboard. And as I said, you can see from the pages of the New York Times over the last 6 weeks, I mean, it's gone so far to the left on intersectional critical race and gender theory that it sounds like a social justice seminar at a far left-wing college campus. I think this is a situation in which you have institutions that don't have strong leadership, that are going to tell their workforce that, you don't run this newsroom, you don't run this organization, you're not even working this beat. And if you don't like that, you can go work somewhere else. And there's 10 more people who'd be happy to come in here and take your job. We are a newspaper that's dedicated to a diversity of opinion. Our editorial has an obvious left-wing bent. However, that's the exact point of having an op-ed pages, opposite of the editorial, where we publish different views for our readers to see. But because so many of their newsroom staffers and really so many of their readers don't want to hear dissenting opinions, don't share that kind of traditional liberal view that we should have more speech, we should have more free exchange of ideas, but rather want to silence any dissenting opinions, want to have safe spaces against microaggressions. Again, to use the language of the social justice seminar, the leadership of the New York Times caved. They proved that they're a laughingstock, and you can see that in their pages today.
During the debate over replacing the Affordable Care Act, I remember you addressing a town hall in Arkansas, and it was a town hall that was essentially packed with people who took strong exception to your views. I'll put it that way. And one thing I was really struck by, one thing I was very impressed by, is that you just very calmly, methodically, and very politely engaged with what was a kind of unrelenting barrage of hostile criticism. And this incident with the New York Times made me think of that because, in a way, for you as an elected official, and just in having observed you for some years, you really do seem to take seriously the mission of reaching people who don't share your priors, who don't necessarily agree with you. And I wonder about your thoughts on how the media landscape has changed since you were first elected to Congress. You're someone who has been, you were educated at Harvard Law School. You've kind of been in many elite settings. You've had to interact with people with very different views for much of your adult life. It seems like something that you take seriously. You don't just want to preach to the choir. So how has the changing media landscape affected your ability to communicate?
Ryan, it's gotten harder to reach a diverse audience with lots of different viewpoints at the national level. I say that in distinction to the local level. Like when we had the Attorney General in Arkansas a week before last, we interviewed with local television stations, the local newspaper. They asked tough but fair questions that we were happy to engage. That's not really the case, though, I don't think, anymore. In the major national newspapers like the New York Times or the Washington Post, major news channels like CNN and MSNBC or networks news divisions. I mean, I can't get inside the heads of these editors and producers and the emotional reactions they've had to the election of Donald Trump over the last 3.5 years. And that continues to distort their coverage and their news judgment, that every story is portrayed through the lens of Donald Trump, even if that has nothing to do with the president or nothing to do with the federal government or nothing to do with politics whatsoever. I can tell you that in my first 2 or 4 years in office, I was a much more common guest on those stations or interviewed with those newspapers, in part because they wanted to have a fair hearing of ideas. They wanted to give their readers and their viewers a chance to hear a different viewpoint. That's really not the case anymore. It's very hard to go on those channels, to speak in those newspapers, and have anything other than just a shouting fest where they're berating Republican office holders for supporting the president that was elected by more than 300 electoral votes. I get it that they don't like Donald Trump and they want to defeat him, and that distorts their news coverage. That's fine. They've got a chance to do that in 15 weeks. And they can do it then if they want to. But in the meantime, we would be better served if supposedly objective and neutral newspapers like the New York Times, like the Washington Post, or cable news channels or major network news divisions actually tried to report the news, not spin it, not slant it, not put it in the context of how terrible the president is and how terrible all of his supporters all across the country must be, but simply presented the news as news.
How is it that you've been navigating this environment? Do you rely more on social media, for example, in order to get your message directly to your constituents and to people around the country? Or I wonder, is there some other approach you're taking, given this expectation that much of the media coverage is not necessarily going to give a full and fair accounting of your views?
We're fortunate in Arkansas that we have one of the country's truly great regional newspapers, the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, that still has a correspondent in Washington, D.C., which is rare for regional newspapers these days. So that newspaper, given its dominant position in Arkansas, is a good opportunity to reach out to all Arkansans. Our local TV stations, as I said, in Little Rock, and Northwest Arkansas, and Northeast Arkansas, do a very good job of covering us anytime we're traveling around the state. It's been a little bit harder over the last 4 months, of course, but no, they do a good job. We have a good cooperative working relationship with them. I also use talk radio a lot. I believe my other colleagues from Arkansas use talk radio. You can always call into a radio station in Little Rock or in Fayetteville during the week while we're in session in Washington and reach listeners that way. And then, of course, social media, especially Facebook. I know that Twitter is the assignment editor for the New York Times and MSNBC. But very few Arkansans are on that platform. The vast majority of all Americans, though, or all Arkansans, like most Americans that use social media, are on Facebook, and that's a very effective way to keep Arkansans up to date on what is happening in Washington, what we're doing for them, the kind of help that we can provide them with the federal government. So across all those different medium, I think that we do a pretty good job of reaching out to Arkansans. We always try to find ways to improve, to be in contact with them. Like the town hall you mentioned earlier, I think we had to move venues 3 different times to accommodate more than 2,000 guests, and we still had people lined up outside. Obviously, as you said, we got a lot of folks from the center left in Arkansas that didn't agree with what I said. But, even in Arkansas, if you got a 2/3 approval rating, that means 1 million people disapprove of the job you're doing. And it's important to listen to them as well, and that they know that whether you agree or disagree with them, you'll give them a respectful hearing and answer their questions fair and square and straight up and honestly.
We've received a number of questions from our audience, and so I'll just go ahead and share one with you now. What will the Senate majority do to prevent cities and states from using funds to abandon broken windows policing?
So I think that may be referring specifically to legislation that will be under debate this week and for the coming 2 weeks about virus recovery measures. The one thing we don't want to do is to provide funds with no strings attached to cities and states like Chicago and Illinois and Connecticut that have been profligate and irresponsible in their public finances for decades. I am sympathetic, though, to any city and state that had sound budgeting that has seen a decline in tax revenue, because I know because of the pandemic, because I know that hurts police officers, firefighters, and so forth. However, the Department of Justice already has some ability to make conditional grants to those institutions using best practice policing techniques. And I think the Senate should consider extending those to ensure that we're not giving money to radical mayors who want less their police chiefs and their police officers do their job, engage in the very kinds of policing tactics that help reduce crime before crime even occurs, like broken windows policing, like community policing.
Another question in a similar vein, will you support more effective training and more community outreach for our officers? It seems unfair to them to send them into situations they have no training for.
That's absolutely unfair to them. That's why the defund the police movement is so insane. All these far left wingers that are advocating for defunding the police want to do so because they want to have police react in less violent ways or de-escalate situations that could be de-escalated. Well, those aren't natural or easy techniques to learn. You have to be trained in those techniques, especially if you're a young and new officer. But anyone who's run an organization knows that one of the first things that gets cut when budgets are tight is training. If you want the police to be well-trained, to be professional, the police need more funding. They need funding for more training, more regular training, for pay raises, for benefits that are going to help recruit and retain the best, the most professional, the most public spirited among us. So I believe very strongly that we should provide police officers and sheriff's deputies and all law enforcement officers with that kind of effective training in difficult but teachable techniques that help improve policing, improve public safety, improve the trust of the communities that are being policed.
Do you expect there to be support in Phase 4 legislation for law enforcement agencies at the state and local level?
Potentially, Rayhan. It is dependent in part on how big the scope of that legislation is. One thing that Senate Republicans have insisted about from the very beginning, going back to February, is that we not use the crisis of this pandemic to lard up a bunch of unrelated measures. Now, I've got a lot of priorities that aren't related to this pandemic. I'm not pushing them on this legislation. I didn't push them in the last legislation. There is a link, of course, as I mentioned earlier, between the impact that this pandemic has had on local tax revenue, especially sales tax revenue, and the ability to fund our police departments. Now, we provided over $100 billion of funding for local and state governments in the last major piece of legislation, much of which is unspent, some of which it turns out had too many strings attached to it. What Little Rock needs may be different from what Jonesboro needs, and what we need in Arkansas may be different from what's needed in Wisconsin. So one thing we should do in this legislation, in my opinion, is go back and look at the conditions we put on that money and allow states and cities and towns to have more flexibility in the way they use it. That's what I've heard from our governor, Asa Hutchinson. That's what most senators have heard from their governors as well, is that they need more flexibility in how to spend that money to address the needs of their states and their communities as the pandemic has impacted them in local and particular ways.
A number of your colleagues in the Senate, including Senator Rand Paul, have argued that criminal justice reform, the term that they embrace, that they use, is essential for reaching Black American voters, to build that constituency, to help win over those voters to the GOP. This is essential. However, there's another argument, which is that when you're looking at violent crime, when you're looking at the disproportionate victims of violent crime, something that you've invoked, it is typically Black and brown communities that are disproportionately burdened by violent crime. Do you believe that that's an argument we'll be seeing and hearing more of from you and other colleagues who believe that we need to take a more forceful, proactive approach to policing?
Yeah, sadly, too many of our Black fellow citizens have been the victims of violent crime, these shootings and these murders over the last few weeks. It seems like every Monday morning there's another horrific story of a young child, even toddlers and infants, being killed accidentally in stray gunfire. That has to stop. And the way to stop it is stronger, more effective policing and cracking down on the violent, often repeat offenders who are committing these heinous crimes. That's a simple fact. And anytime policing pulls back, anytime you have rising crime rates, unfortunately, in our big cities at least, it almost always disproportionately hurts our Black fellow citizens. So we should, again, keep in mind, as we've seen in the crimes that have been committed over these last 2 months, the impact that reduced policing or less effective policing has on all of our fellow citizens. Some politicians may have security details. They may live behind armed gates, but very few Americans live that way. And those Americans are the ones that need the protection of the police more than anyone.
There's been a great deal of controversy recently over the deployment of federal agents to a number of cities. And so we have a question. Is sending undercover DHS officers to Portland to arrest people a violation of states' rights?
No, of course it's not. It's no more a violation of the prerogatives of Oregon as a state than trying to defend Fort Sumter was from insurrectionists in 1861. Look, we've all seen the news. There's been vandals attacking federal courthouse or other federal buildings in downtown Portland. The federal government has a right, it has a duty to defend all federal property. If anything, the federal government should have deployed agents earlier to protect federal properties, and they should be arresting them and they should be charging them and doing so in a public fashion that deters all of these anarchists and rioters and insurrectionists on our streets.
Do you believe that there's a role for federal law enforcement when you have cities that are facing a particularly sharp spike in violent crime, even if it's not necessarily anarchist or insurrectionist activity per se?
There can be a role. That role is much easier when you have the cooperation of local authorities. Just week before last, the Department of Justice launched Operation Legend, for instance, in Kansas City, that is helping surge more federal support into the city to try to stop the crime wave there. Much harder to do, though, in a place like Portland, where you don't have the support of the local mayor or the governor of the state. You have to remember, too, that federal law enforcement is relatively small compared to the millions of police officers and sheriff's deputies we have across the country. In Washington, specialized law enforcement agencies like the Park Police or the Secret Service, the Customs and Border Police, they were able to help quell the rioting in Washington, D.C. That's a really unique situation since Washington is a federal city. You simply don't have that kind of presence in large numbers of federal law enforcement officers in most cities around the country. That's why it falls first to our local police and sheriff's deputies to try to stop this crime wave that's building. Now, if local authorities want the cooperation of the federal government, then it is absolutely incumbent on the Department of Justice to provide that support, as they have in many cities already over the last couple months.
Senator Cotton, one more question for you. The revolutionary movement in the 1960s was not where Americans were ideologically, and it resulted in two significant Republican victories in 1968 and 1972. Do you think the current excesses of the left will generate a similar result?
They could, Raihan, but these things are never determined until the voters go to the polls in November. And as I said, the Democrats want to make this a campaign issue. I think that they are badly miscalculating. The vast majority of Americans respect the police. They want public safety. They want to be protected from criminals, much less from criminal anarchists and insurrectionists who seem to roam with impunity in cities like Portland and Seattle. We need to respond to those desires, make it clear that while we'll always respect the rights of peaceful protests and demonstrations in this country, while we're always open to trying to improve policing techniques and to building trust among policed communities, we have zero tolerance for the kind of violence that we have seen in our streets in places like Portland and Seattle over the last 2 months.
Senator, you've been very generous with your time. Thank you very much for a fascinating conversation. I want to thank you again for joining us and speaking to our audience. I also want to thank everyone who tuned in and asked questions this afternoon. If you would like to hear more from the Manhattan Institute, I encourage you to subscribe to our newsletters and to make a contribution. There are links for doing so in the comments window below. Thank you again, Senator. This was terrific. Deeply grateful for your time.
Thank you, Raihan, and thanks to the Manhattan Institute again, not just for this forum, but for all you've done to help make America safe over the last 25, 30 years.